Mr. Secretary, good morning. Thank you very much for joining us.
I'm happy to be with you.
Mr. Secretary, here in Texas, as you probably know, the conversation around rural communities and the federal government is often couched in terms of what the feds are doing to us. Over the last month, we've gotten examples of what the feds are doing for us. I would cite the example from last month, October 12th, the Emergency Rural Health Care Grants Program, more than $3 million to Texas counties like Comanche County, Jack County, and Titus County. A couple days later, $740,000 from the Outreach and Assistance for Socially Disadvantaged Farmers and Ranchers and Veteran Farmers and Ranchers Program. The following week, almost $5 million from the Rural Development Reconnect Loan and Grant Program to increase access to high-speed internet. And then most recently, about $500,000 to expand meat and poultry processing in Texas. None of this, of course, is us alone. Other states are getting similar grants. The point is you're investing in rural Texas. How come?
Well, I think first it starts with the importance of rural places and rural people, Evan.
Yep.
The reality is most of our food, a lot of our water, most of our energy comes from rural places, and as a result of the labor of rural people. It is the place where most of us go when we want to get away from it all, to the iconic landscapes of this country,
Yep.
located in rural places. And it's also a place that disproportionately sends its sons and daughters into the military. And as a result, it does a great service to this country. So it's important and necessary for us to invest in this important place. And the president feels very strongly about this, so strongly that when he signed an equity executive order, which normally you would talk about gender and race and things of that nature, the word rural was also included in that equity order because he understood, and I understand, that far too often rural places and rural people are forgotten or left behind. That is not the case with this administration. We are making significant investments in rural places, and we're going to continue to do so.
So when we talk about diversity, we talk about marginalized communities, sometimes that diversity is a diversity based on geography as opposed to demography, and many of those rural communities are themselves, as you say, forgotten and marginalized.
That's correct, and I think there's a reason for it. And I think the reason is that for far too long, we have allowed an extraction economy to take hold in rural places, which is to say what is grown, raised, produced from rural places is taken from those rural places. It's transported somewhere else where value, opportunity, wealth is created someplace else. And then that value added product is sold back to rural folks at a higher cost. The challenge here for us in this country, if we really want to do right by rural folks and rural places, is to create a more circular economy where the wealth, the opportunity, the jobs are created where the natural resource advantage is. And this administration is making a concerted effort, investing a significant amount of resource in creating that circular economy.
Without violating the Hatch Act, I don't really actually expect you to violate the Hatch Act on this answer. Let me ask you about how the politics of the moment affect work like this. You know, there are rural communities in all 50 states. Texas is a state that has largely posed itself as hostile to the federal government. You don't care what the politics of a state are or which party is in control. You're investing in communities across the board.
We're investing because it's the right thing to do. And it's a smart thing to do, frankly. Yeah. If you're interested, and I'll give you a couple of examples. If you're truly interested in addressing climate change in a significant way and looking at the opportunity side of climate, then you obviously want to invest in Texas ranches and farms in terms of providing them the resource to be able to be climate smart. And that's what we're doing with our Climate Smart Commodity Partnership Initiative, investing $2.8 billion in projects all across this great country, including Texas, all commodities, all forms of agriculture, essentially being encouraged and incented and provided resources to embrace aggressively climate smart practices.
And what do you do in a state like Texas where the position of the leadership of the state has been, well, be careful if you're going to take any money from the federal government that there aren't strings attached. You might want to think twice about whether it's the infrastructure bill or anything else that's passed in the last 2 years. What's your position on that?
The beauty of the Climate Smart Partnership Initiative is it's totally voluntary. Farmers have the ability to do this. We're working through partnerships with universities, partnerships with farm groups, partnerships with environmental and conservation groups, working collaboratively together and basically providing the resources to farmers to basically adopt and report back the results of climate smart practices, creating a higher value product that then can be sold in the marketplace, and also preparing those farmers and ranchers to be able to take full benefit of ecosystem market opportunities where industries will pay farmers for the carbon storage and sequestration or the greenhouse gas emission reduction that comes from climate smart practices. So it's a new revenue stream, Evan, for farmers and ranchers. And it's one of several new revenue streams that are being produced by this administration, because we understand at the end of the day, if farmers benefit, rural communities will also benefit.
Mr. Secretary, you know rural. After law school, you moved to your wife's small hometown in rural Iowa. You eventually served as mayor and as state senator before becoming governor of the state of Iowa for 2 terms. What did you learn during those years as first a resident and then an advocate on the ground for rural communities in what may be the most iconic rural state?
Well, I learned first and foremost how hardworking the people in rural communities are, how deeply they care about their families and their community and their country. And frankly, they do feel at times left behind and left out of the conversation. And it's important and necessary for us to have strong rural communities, if for no other reason than to take pressure off growing cities, if for no other reason than to prevent the concreting over of prime farmland at a time when we're dealing with issues involving global food security. They're very proud people. They really appreciate the role that they've played in feeding the world. And they feel that the country sometimes takes that for granted and takes them for granted. And so as governor and secretary, I try to make sure that I speak up for them and in a variety of ways, and try to advocate for an economy that will support them and their families.
Did you come to any better understanding then, or do you have one now, of why it is exactly that rural communities are often ignored, left out of conversations at state legislatures, at the federal level?
I just don't think people understood the sophistication and requirements of farming. I think the view is that agriculture is a relatively simple process, that you throw a few seeds on the ground and something pops up. The reality of agriculture is it's a very sophisticated business. It's a very difficult and troublesome business, because you can be the best farmer and rancher in the world, and you still could go bankrupt if Mother Nature decides not to provide the resources to allow your crop or your livestock to be raised and grown. And that's why it's important and necessary, Evan, for us to look for additional ways for farmers to raise revenue from what they do on the farm. By doing so, I think we can reintegrate agriculture into the mainstream and then begin to get more attention paid to the needs of agriculture in rural communities.
Right. Speaking of 2 terms, Mr. Secretary, this is your second time in the job at USDA. You served 8 years as President Barack Obama's Agriculture Secretary. I wonder why you wanted to return. Not often that happens. What was the unfinished work? What was the need you identified?
The reality is it's never happened before in the Department of Agriculture. And I give a simple answer to that question. It's I love the people that I work for, and I love the people I work with. We've talked about the important role that rural folks play in the country, but the people who work at USDA are a committed bunch. They really genuinely care about what they do. In terms of unfinished business, the reality is a lot of what we started in the Obama administration in terms of support for local and regional food systems has become even more important and significant as a result of what we learned from the pandemic. With the American Rescue Plan resources, I now have the ability to put money into new processing and build capacity and competition for our livestock producers. I have the opportunity to support more organic production, which is a higher value proposition, resources to create regional food business centers to help strengthen local and regional food systems, creating new opportunities and new markets for farmers. This is an extension of Know Your Farmer, which was started in the Obama administration. So it's an extension, it's a continuation, it's a cementing of these additional revenue sources that are so vital, I think, for farm families to be able to be viable.
So if I go to the USDA website today, what I see are 3, not only 3, but principally 3 big themes, things that you're focused on during your time now as secretary: food, climate, and the economy. I want to take each of those one at a time. You've already mentioned food a couple times. One of the things I've discovered in my travels around Texas is that the food scarcity conversation, among many others, is a real thing in rural communities. I might not have known that if I hadn't actually gone and talked to people on the ground there. Talk a little bit about prioritizing food, issues related to food production and food access as a focus of your time.
Well, there are 2 key issues involving food. There's the food insecurity that millions of Americans still today deal with on a regular basis. And then there's also the issue of nutrition insecurity. You can be fed but not fed well. And the reality at USDA is we're trying to address both of those issues, like taking a look at our nutrition programs and modernizing them, allowing for greater convenience, allowing for encouraged outreach so people who qualify for programs know about them and participate in them. Let me give you an example. A lot of people, when they think of the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, which is providing food assistance to families, think that most of the people who are receiving that benefit are folks who are not working, folks who are sort of gaming the system. But the reality is that more than 80% of folks on that program are either working moms and dads with children, or people with severe disabilities who can't work in the workplace, or senior citizens who have worked their entire life and are now living on a fixed income. Many of those senior citizens don't know that they qualify for SNAP. Or if they do, maybe they think that they're not entitled to SNAP benefits, or maybe they're proud about the notion of taking assistance. The reality is we need to make sure that they understand that it's in our collective best interest for them to receive proper nutrition, because when they do, there are better health outcomes. And when there are better health outcomes, it means we spend less money on our healthcare system, which means our insurance premiums aren't as high. I mean, the reality is we collectively benefit when we make sure that people have adequate resources at home to be able to feed themselves. And on the nutrition security side, really the focus is a lot on children and young people. We want to make sure they get a good, healthy start to life. When they do, they learn better. When they learn better, they become more productive citizens in the future. So it's, again, in our collective best interest to focus on both of those issues.
Right. Now, you talked about climate earlier, and that's obviously a focus for probably a number of departments of the federal government at the moment. You know, again, you've got some resistance in states like Texas who believe that this issue is entirely political. Talk a bit about how you think you can be best of service and of use in talking about climate to communities where there may be some skepticism or concern about lost jobs, lost wages. You know, if we put these regulations in place, what's it going to mean for these communities?
Well, I look at the Climate Smart Partnership Initiative that we've started, and the reality is that when you convert agricultural waste into a variety of new products, you're creating new manufacturing jobs. And those manufacturing jobs are going to be located in rural places. It's going to bring manufacturing back. Let me give you a couple of examples.
Sure.
If you can turn agricultural waste into a thing called sustainable aviation and marine fuel. When you think about it, there's a lot of conversation about electric cars, but not as much conversation about electric boats and electric airplanes. Right. Why? Because we simply don't have the battery capacity yet. Hydrogen has not yet been developed. So we're going to need a lower carbon fuel to be able to make sure that our planes and our ships are also contributing to reduced emissions. Well, that sustainable aviation fuel and marine fuel is a 36 billion gallon industry that has yet to be developed. It's a brand new industry. It's basically taking agricultural waste, woody biomass, and turning it into something incredibly valuable. Is that important to our security? You bet it is, because it's going to also help our military be a more sustainable military. So we're talking about literally doubling the biofuel industry that exists today. Hundreds of thousands of jobs, new manufacturing facilities, more construction opportunities. That's one example. Second example, in our forest, as we deal with these massive forest fires, one way we can do that, deal with that, is by reducing the fuel buildup that's taken place over literally decades. What could we convert that into? Well, mass timber. The ability to make high-rise buildings, skyscrapers, if you will, with the structural materials being wood and not steel or concrete, which have a heavy greenhouse gas emission issue. This mass timber is actually more fire retardant, believe it or not, than cement and steel. In a massive fire, it singes. It doesn't burn. It doesn't collapse like steel and concrete. So tremendous opportunities here for new jobs, new processing jobs, new ways of using what's grown and raised in rural communities in a very sustainable way. So that's just one example of multiple examples that I could point to in terms of how climate creates opportunity, how it creates rural opportunity, and how it helps to create rural wealth.
And when you make the case for programs like the ones you just enumerated, do you get resistance, or do you get people saying, actually, this could be transformational for our communities? What are you hearing?
The beauty of it is it plays into the strengths and the value system of rural places. Yeah. It's voluntary, it's market driven, it's incentive driven. It's not regulated. It's basically saying, here's an opportunity, here are resources, take advantage of it. And here's what's interesting, Evan. You know, you hear a lot of pushback in agricultural areas about climate change. But when we provided resources under our Climate Smart Partnership Initiative, we had over 1,000 applications. We put $1 billion initially into this. We got $20 billion of requests. We got 1,050 applications.
Right. The demand is greater than the supply at this point of dollars to do this.
Absolutely, which indicates and suggests a significant interest now in rural America to be part of the opportunity side of climate.
Right. Let me ask you about the economy. You know, one of the big focuses in Texas on the economy as it relates to rural is lack of access to broadband. We saw this most especially during the pandemic, where you had 1 out of 3 rural Texans who did not have access to Zoom school or to telemedicine or to the kind of economic development opportunities that broadband might provide. And there was an estimated loss of economic activity to the state of $5 billion purely on the basis of lack of access to broadband. I called out one investment that you all made on broadband earlier, and Secretary Buttigieg, when he was in Texas a couple of weeks ago, talked a lot about the investments that through the infrastructure bill are going to be made on the broadband side. Talk about that. What are the biggest challenges from your perspective on the economic opportunity side for rural?
Well, there's been a lot of conversation and talk about high-speed internet, but the Biden-Harris administration has been the first administration to put real money behind it. We've nickel and dimed this for quite a significant period of time, and we've had projects here and there. But actually, a $65 billion investment under the bipartisan infrastructure law gives us the resources to literally be able to connect everyone in the country, regardless of how remote they may be in terms of where they live, to high-speed internet and to the opportunities it presents: distance learning, telemedicine, business development, precision agriculture, you name it. At USDA, our goal and our responsibility is basically to make sure that broadband facilities that currently exist are in fact meaningful. You can have broadband, but the download and upload speeds can be so limited that you really, frankly, don't have much. What we're doing now with our Reconnect program is we're investing in programs across the state of Texas and other states across the United States, putting resources in to allow folks to increase the capacity of their existing broadband system. The Department of Commerce and the Federal Communication Commission, with their programs, will take $63 billion. And over the next couple of years, starting next year, they'll begin to make grants to states to basically encourage states to work with us collaboratively to get to those remote areas that currently are unserved by broadband and make sure that adequate technology is available to folks. So eventually, at the end of the day, when these resources are invested, all of America, regardless of where you live, regardless of what your zip code is, will have access to this technology.
And of course, I think about population declines in rural communities connected directly back to the issues we've just been talking about. When people grow up in a rural community, go away to school, don't come back, it's often because they believe opportunities don't exist, and those opportunities may not exist because those sorts of things, broadband access, just as an example, may not be there. In Texas right now, we have 3 million people in rural communities, which is only 10% of the population of the state, but that's still more than the populations of 18 other states. Rural Texas would be the 33rd largest state in the country if it were its own state.
Here's what's interesting about this. Often people say, well, that's great, you can have a high-speed internet, but people aren't going to be able to afford it. Well, actually, they will be able to afford it because of the Affordable Connectivity Program. As resources are being made available by the federal government, one of the conditions will be that you offer a plan that costs no more than $30 a month.
Right.
And for folks who have a income less than 200% of poverty, they will qualify for the Affordable Connectivity Program, which provides them a $30 a month subsidy.
Right. So it's not just access, it's affordability.
That's correct. You got to have both.
Right. So back to the population question. So I was really going to ask you if you think it's conceivable for us to reverse that trend. Is there anything that you and the federal government can do about that? This is not just a Texas problem. This is in every state where the population in the rural communities is beginning to decline and decline. What do we do about that?
Well, if you create a climate smart economy based on agriculture that expands significantly the number of revenue streams for farmers, when you use bio-based product manufacturing and bring back manufacturing, when you create local and regional food systems and the supply chain that supports a local and regional food system, when you expand access to broadband, and when you invest in housing, you essentially create the opportunity for folks who want to come back to that small town, who like the notion of their kids going to a school where the teacher actually knows who they are and who their parents are. Then you're going to see people have that opportunity that prior to today they felt was not available. So I'm convinced that when you change the economy from an extraction economy to a circular economy, you create these new opportunities and you have the amenities to support them. You're going to see an influx of people coming back to these small towns. And it's going to take a lot of pressure, as I said, off of cities. It's going to make sure we don't have to continually concrete over this prime farmland that is going to be so vital, not just to our future, but to global food security as well.
Okay, Mr. Secretary, thank you. That's all the time we have. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
All right.